Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeffrey Leppendorf, Executive Director of the John Cage Trust. Welcome to another edition of Chance Encounters with John Cage, where we ask questions, we accept answers like Cage. We don't know what will happen. We have a little idea, but we're not entirely sure. It is my great pleasure today to welcome Ed McKeon, who I had the wonderful chance to spend some time with months ago in London, where he is coming to us from. We're international here. And let me tell you a bit about Ed. He's a curatorial producer and researcher who is concerned with rewiring relations between gallery arts and post-experimental musics. His work addresses the meaningful articulation of time in artistic practice and production, and how musical and more than musical practices create time-bound public spheres or communities of relative strangers. He operates in the zone where music interdisciplines with other art forms, theater, book, installations, performance, and has collaborated with everyone from Pauline Oliveros to Tin Men and the Telephone, from Elaine Michener to Brian Eno. I first became acquainted with Ed from his book, Heiner Goebbels and Curatorial Composing After Cage, which came out from Cambridge University Press in 2022. Loved it. And then we had a Zoom meeting, and Ed will hold it out in a minute, but we're not going to see yet you, Ed, holding it up because you're not speaking yet, but give me a sec. And he lectures currently on music management and curation at Goldsmiths Universities in London. Welcome, Ed.
Thanks very much, Jeffrey.
And now,
Thanks so much for the
why don't you
invitation.
hold your book up since I know you've got it there with you, so they can
Okay,
all see. Yeah, yeah,
there
how
it
they
is.
represent it. So, Ed, as to begin with, since your book starts with Cage and goes beyond to folks curatorial composing today, and we'll define that shortly. Maybe I could ask you just how you first became engaged with Cage, and what led to then ultimately you being interested in this concept of curatorial composing, your term, but
Yeah.
it comes from Cage originally in practice.
Well, it was an accident as much as anything else. I was one of the first years to study music at GCSE. GCSE was a change from O level, which is like 16, the exams that you take age 16 in the UK. And the curriculum had changed that it included composition, not just musicology and other kinds of practice. But of course, the older teachers didn't necessarily know how to teach composition, and they were afraid of new music, this being the late 1980s. So my music teacher brought in a couple of students for one of the sessions. She brought in a couple of students from Manchester University who took us through some exercises with chants, not really quite Cajun. They played with dice as much as anything else. But the things that I took from it really were one, that it was permissive. There were a variety of different things that you could do, and that this was interesting. And the other one was that it scared the hell out of my teachers. So that was a really good combination, and really drove me on, I think, from there.
That's fantastic. I have to say one of the things I really love about Cage overall is that I think, like it or dislike what he does, I think it gives us permission to not know what's going on, which can
Yeah.
be really wonderful.
And it's really wonderful as well for audiences who um, aren't invested in a particular singular way of understanding what music is and can be. So it becomes really enriching. I mean, my family background is of people who like music but aren't musical. They're not well educated. It's quite in terms of informal terms, it's quite a humble family and upbringing. But I'm always interested in how new music and new artist experiences can reach people who are like my family, or like people that I grew up with. Um, I mean, the other Cage experience would be when I was running Oxford Contemporary Music, putting on basically whatever new music I thought was interesting in whatever space I could get access to. Putting on Isabel Ettenauer, who's a pianist from Vienna who specializes in music for toy piano. So she performed some Cage for me in the Contemporary Art Gallery in Oxford, but she also did a performance at a day centre for people who are basically very old, and it's that they're often socially isolated. So it's like once or twice a week, you might go to a day centre, get your hair cut, play bingo, read, see other people, be given a cup of tea. But they also had this performance of Cage, and they also had a group of primary school children there as well. So you had children aged 9, and you had older people in their 70s and 80s and 90s. And it was wonderful. The people were concentrated, and it was just a really wonderful experience. So I like the way that Cage makes possible certain kinds of musical experience that are quite rare.
You know, it is. I'm so glad you mentioned children. I had a great experience last summer of putting on a concert of very avant-garde, very avant-garde musicians from around the globe. It was quite a way out concert, and a lot of the pieces were theatrical as well as musical, and often there wasn't even sound in some of them, there was just movement and so forth.
Yeah.
And a lot of children were brought by their parents, and my first thought was, and I should have known better, was, oh no. And in fact, the kids were rapt. They were the best audience because they didn't know that they were supposed to hate it. You know, they just loved the weird things going on. They had a ball. They
Absolutely
loved,
that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So let's get to this idea of curatorial. It's very hard for me to say it. Curatorial composing. I will not say to try to say it 3 times fast. Curatorial composing. Can you give us a kind of a definition, and then we'll dive into some works.
Sure, I'll give some characteristics of it first of all. So one is that it's a focus on the way in which experience itself is composed. So a temporal experience, which could be something like this, it could be online, it could be the way that different elements of an artwork or an artistic experience are put together. So that could be the composition of an exhibition. It could be the composition of different elements that make a work that's observed or experienced in some way. That it has a shape and a pattern and a form to it. And it's one that is not inherent exclusively to the object, but it is to the encounter, and therefore it's constitutively open to the way in which those who encounter and experience it also co-constitute or bring their own sense of memory and experience and anticipation into how that event, that experience becomes meaningful for them and for the others with them at the same time. So that's very broad terms. There are some other aspects of it as well. One is, we'll perhaps come on to this later, but it's my way of thinking music in the expanded field. So I came to this by studying curating in its relationship to music, because I was interested in the way that music seemed to have lost its sense of where artistic value lay. And indeed, the traditional way of constituting musical value in musical works was bankrupt in many respects. And there was a real problem because there was no, if you like, shared set of criteria or shared ways of evaluating what work might be important and what might not be important. So I thought looking at curatorial theory would be a way into that. And what I found was music was excluded from that conversation. So you could read all of the literature on curating and curatorial theory, and the only reference to music that you would find is that it's similar to curating a cheese board or a restaurant menu or the decor of a hotel or a restaurant. But of course, you could have sound art or performance art that were curated. So on the one hand, it interested me that this exclusion was in play and that there were other words or other terms that were being used for practices that were at the very least adjacent to music, if not extensions of experimental musics. And then there was all these other practices that weren't. So it was a kind of an inside and an outside relationship. But then as I got to know the theory a bit better, I began to be interested in the way that those within the art field were often concerned with the way in which those exclusions functioned as well, and were trying to find their way outside of that particular logic. And what they were finding their way towards was something that was more temporal in its organization. And it began to remind me, actually, well, in a sense, we were all there, we were there, or the Cage was there, and others were there back in the 1960s. So perhaps rather than being often behind the field, or there's a sense within new music that we're always decades behind where the art world is in terms of its thought, it began to occur to me that actually, in many respects, we were in some ways decades ahead, but overlooked in terms of the significance of the shift that was made. So it's got a lot of other implications to it.
You know, there's so much there. I'm going to pull out a few things. The idea that, well, one, the idea that curation might engage time. Let's just leave it for a moment. And of course, Cage is obsessed with music based on time rather than pulse,
Yeah.
right? Broadly put. And the idea that curatorial theory may have left out music when so much of curation is the simple idea of putting things together. And of course, composing literally means to put together, to
Yeah.
compose. And if we think back to medieval music and so forth, one was not inventing so much as putting bits together, Gregorian chant snippets and so forth. And the idea of where creativity lies was in the participation, perhaps, of those singing these little bits that were put together by somebody, if not God, right?
That's right. And of course,
So,
what you're putting, what's being put together is not necessarily just sounds in
right.
composing. So, in that sense, you're already in the zone of what becomes called theatre in the critique of Cage, certainly by in the art world by Michael Fried and others.
Yeah. And I love it's in, and I forget the exact quote, but it's in From the Birds, the great, six
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
interviews with Cage, where he's asked about the future of the avant-garde. And in essence, not the exact quote, he says that in the future, everything will be theater.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's
And,
absolutely right.
and theater to me is everything, anything and everything, right? Um, I have to say it's been lovely for me to experience, and I know you can talk a lot more about it, that in seeing art exhibitions in art museums, there's been more and more inclusion of sound in the spaces, which I've been thrilled about as opposed to headphones,
Yeah, that's right.
which makes it, an
Well, the
extra thing
Venice
on a
Biennale.
screen. Yeah.
Well, it interested me that there are a number of curatorial projects that have adopted musical techniques or compositional principles and made those either thematic, a little bit like. I mean, I've not been to the current Venice Biennale, but the moniker of In Minor Keys has been an invitation for the curators who've actually put it together, because the curator that was doing the Venice Biennale died before it happened, to invite a number of different musicians and composers to be featured as artists alongside, if you like, the roster of visual artists that might be expected as part of that. Um, but also, there have been projects like the Kunsthalle for Music by Ari Benjamin Myers, which is, if you like, it's a musical exhibition as a touring show that sits as a kind of parasite within various host institutions that allow it to be there. And it insists on the word music rather than sound, which I think is
Mm.
productive. The one that I wrote on in my PhD was Documenta 14, held between Kassel and Athens, where the not only was Pauline Oliveros' work featured in it and quoted, cited a number of times in the accompanying catalogue, but also the curators adopted a compositional form called of the epicycle by Yanni Christou, and in particular the principle of continuum and metapraxis that are part of that, which I also see as very much in the same spirit as Cage in curatorial composing, and I could give examples from Yanni Christou's work that would echo the same kinds of principles I described earlier.
Why don't we back up a bit to set the stage with Cage? And then I do want to spend some time. We have everyone, we have an amazing clip that we're going to show that's not public. So it's kind of thrilling to be able to show it here. Um, so let's go back to Cage. So would you say that this sort of concept of curatorial composing might start with the theater piece of 1960, the famous Black Mountain work, or later with like the operas, a reunion, some of the other works that clearly are these where's the composition kind of works, that one might ask.
I take it really from a similar time, but not that piece. I take it from 0 minutes 00 seconds, or
Mm.
otherwise 433 number two, as it's otherwise called. Not the very first performance, but the articulation of it that he gives after it, precisely because of the he takes five principles at that point, and I have to roll back a little bit because it's about the way in which Cage uses chance and why he brings chance into composition. So my argument is that he breaks with what in musical terms is called the work concept, which is helpfully described in a key book by Lydia Gurr, in a book called The Imaginary Museum of Musical Work. So immediately, in a sense, you're in a museum context, and you can imagine a kind of a musical curator that will be deciding what music goes into the canon and goes inside the museum, and what kinds of musics don't belong in a museum or don't belong in that kind of museum. And she says that it's very difficult to get outside of the musical work concept. You can't do it just from outside. It has to be somehow from inside the logic of the musical museum. And so that I take it his studies with Schoenberg as being very important for understanding it in these terms. So for Schoenberg, he's using theme and variation, basically, or a continual variation, so that there isn't any repetition, but there is, you start off with a germinal seed or a germinal idea, and that generates all of the material in essentially two-dimensional harmonic space. What is how pitch moves and how time moves forward. What Cage does is he removes the Grundgestalt, the primary element, the foundational principle, if you like, the keystone, the origin, the identity, if you like. And in that space, in that vacant space, that space is not absent; it's actually productive. And it's that what he's then looking to do is make a continual change or a process of continual change that we can be open to without it being based on that initial foundational set of principles. So it's the term that he uses, which I think is really significant and really helpful, is the continuity of a morphology. So what you experience is something which is continually changing without reference to an original starting point.
Right. So the major shift really is that we're not focused on development in the
That's right.
traditional musical
Oh,
sense.
completely, completely.
And we're also
And not fixing the parameters of something in a kind of a musical object.
exactly right. And then similarly, less concerned or not concerned at all with reproduction, which so much music production is generally concerned with, classical music.
That's right, with repertoire pieces that can be performed and ostensibly are supposed to be the same if they're performed in 1960 in Seattle or in 2026 in Singapore. They're ostensibly the same piece. That's not the case in Cage.
Right. And quite intentionally, this idea of indeterminate works, which won't be the same
That's right.
repeated.
Um, that's
The
right.
idea of
So
repetition changes.
completely, and it's revolutionary. And I think it also the implications of it are also really significant. I think one brief thing. I don't want to labour this too much because it gets a little bit thorny, but the kind of musical practice that Schoenberg represented, that particularly if you read Adorno on Schoenberg, is one in which the kind of articulation of time is a reflection of a kind of historical philosophy. It's one that is constrained by, so as a composer in a Schoenbergian model, in a sense, you can write whatever you choose to write. You have a kind of subjective freedom, but at the same time, you can only write something that is you're compelled to write because of the conditions of possibility of the art form at that particular moment in time. So you have subjective freedom, but you also have something that is constrained by an historical knowledge of what the art form is and has been.
Yeah.
Which Cage paraphrases. I was really pleased when I realized that this is what Cage was paraphrasing. Anything goes, however, not everything is attempted. Or his other way of putting it was anything goes, but only when zero is taken as the basis.
Yeah. I love a similar quote as just because I use chance doesn't mean I don't make choices.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he chooses the questions to ask.
Exactly.
It's a disciplined approach, but it's not disciplined in the sense that he's reinserting his ego into the whole process, which is how he tends to be critiqued. It requires discipline to remove ego from the process, and indeed to invite an audience or a public to remove the kinds of conditioned expectations that they might bring into a performance, so that when it doesn't do the things that they expect, like express an internal emotion or a feeling, or have something to explicit to say about the world, that they're not then disappointed, but actually they can just be open to the occasion of that experience.
Yeah, and I think that's where it becomes challenging for many people. Where does taste lie? Is it absent? I would say no, but intention is different than that. And one can have a style even though removing the ego through this process of discipline and asking questions, but accepting answers.
Completely. Oh, and just to go back to the 0 minutes 00 seconds and the
Yeah.
reason why that's important. Um, One of the things that Cage come to understand is that as soon as you liberate five different elements, then the way in which you might hear something as being related to something else that happens, you get to a level of complexity where it's much less likely that you hear something as being intentionally related to something that has happened before or that sets up an expectation for something that happens afterwards. So it's a fairly it's an interesting kind of mathematical point, but
Yeah,
it's
I,
something that
I
he
would
introduced from then on. Yeah.
I would also say it's maybe fair to call it, it's actually a poetic strategy, which is to say that in wonderful contemporary poetry, say like of John Ashbery or other poets of that ilk, that does it mean A or B? And the answer is maybe it's both, maybe it's C. And they're all the right answer. That there is no answer. There are many, many possible answers, and they all can coexist and be
Yeah.
different for any one listener, which makes this a more participatory form of art. It doesn't mean the audience has to be out on stage dancing, but the question of participation changes from passive listening to actively making connections for you individually, and they may be absolutely different from another you
Yeah.
experiencing the work, right?
Or without reconstituting, in philosophical terms, a subject-object relationship. That
Right.
is, trying to, in a sense, he's inviting us to let go of that desire, that compulsion to try and make sense of things in terms that we can then own as property. That I can say, well, that means this or that means that to me, and just let it be. So he's he often describes his work or the experience of his work, often actually in the words of other people that have said this to him, as a bit like natural phenomena, or like seeing the night sky, or or being in nature. You experience things in a way where the night sky doesn't have to be something for you. You don't have to make a meaning of it by joining stars together and then saying that's the plough. You can just experience it in a sense as something which has its own particular affect, which might be sublime, it might be glorious, it might be trembling, it might be whatever.
Yeah.
It feels like in that particular moment, but nevertheless, there is something that's magical about that.
And he does say, as even in the lecture on nothing, which is quite early, he makes the statements, we possess nothing. And then he
Yeah,
talks about pleasure deriving from acknowledging that we possess nothing, right? So it is that
because
idea of it's okay. You don't need to fully understand to enjoy.
that's
You can
right.
just be present for it,
And of course, in 1950, he possessed almost nothing.
right?
He was dirt poor,
Yeah,
which I think is one of the aspects of 433, which is often also missed or overlooked.
yeah. It's funny, that work, and we're not going to spend time on 433. We could do a whole, hours and hours on it. But I always find it fascinating. People are very concerned with the length of time of that work, but it
Mm.
says quite explicitly on the score that when David Tudor performed this work, it lasted for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. However, it may be performed for any length of time by any instrument or instruments.
Yeah, well,
It's simply an invitation to be present. That's all.
that's right. It's often performed badly, interestingly.
Yes.
I remember during, I think it might have been the early part of the first lockdowns, watching online because you had time and you were on screens all the time, just watching the number of different performances of 433 that people have recorded and put online. And there are some people wearing headphones and doing it, or um, there are so many where people aren't really paying attention to, or they're not being present with it,
Right.
which is that's what the invitation is to do.
I've told many people that have been interested in doing it or talking about it. I think it's actually one of the most difficult pieces to perform.
Yeah,
It's very hard. Actively doing nothing is very hard.
completely.
Being fully present is very, very hard.
And one other aspect of it, which is important for the historical argument that I'm making, is that if we were to finish this conversation, when we finish this conversation, if you were to go into to wherever you are and to either experience 433 for yourself by listening to the sounds of your environment or go to a performance of it, it wouldn't be date stamped 1952 in the way that if you were to listen to Erwartung, it has a kind of a date stamp of 1909,
Right.
1908, 1909 when it's written. So, so Schoenberg's piece. So there is something about the way in which our experience of time is. It's a composition. It has a form. It has a logic, but it's always open to the way in which it's experienced within that particular moment, not always by reference back to some kind of original performance or authentic score or edition, that kind of thing.
It is funny though that that work has come to have a performance practice around it. which I think Cage would find maybe amusing. I will say, just since you referenced the Vartung, one might, confronting a performance of 433 for the very first time, have more anxiety at a performance of 433 than of a Vartung. But jokes aside, why don't we jump to our clip and talk
Yeah.
a little bit about this Louis Andriessen opera, De Materi, which was directed by Heiner Goebbels, who himself is a composer, and we're going to be speaking about what he did as curatorial composition. He, of course, is not the composer of the work, but he is also very much the composer of this work. So you want to give us a little setup for the piece, and we're going to see just an excerpt
Yeah.
from toward the end of the opera, a quite remarkable moment. And for those who were not able to see this live, you're in for really quite a wonderful surprise, I think.
So one little aspect of Heine's practice, certainly from the 1980s, is that he adopted the sampler keyboard as a key instrument. And so once you get used to the idea that, in a sense, you can compose using pre-existing materials, it's only a short step from there to composing with other musicians who bring what they do as musicians, not telling them what to do, but inviting them to do what they do, which he then begins to do both in radio pieces or pieces for radio rather, and then in what he called scenic concerts, staged concerts. Basically, they have a theatrical element to them, but they also involved musicians doing what he invited them to do, their own thing. And it's only then a small step from there to then, if you like, curating, being the director, the intendant of one of the largest performance festivals in Europe, in the Ruhrgebiet of Germany. So this is places like Bochum and Essen and Düsseldorf, and presenting a whole variety of performances, not just programming them, but also I approached this that he was composing them, not necessarily that differently from the way that Cage in his last years was also composing exhibitions.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's a really nice way to think about this work and also what Heiner Goebbels' role is in this work. And he is a kind of co-composer or curatorial composer for this piece. Tell us, without giving away what we're going to see in a sec, but tell us what scene we're in, and then we're going to go into the following scenes, and we can just say what those two things are. I should say there are super titles, but they're in German. So unless anyone here speaks German, you will not know what they're singing, but that's okay. You'll still enjoy it. We can fill in what's happening, but it's sort of not the point, really.
He often uses other languages, including very rare languages, in his pieces. So he's interested in creating a space where meaning is present, but where it's not explicit because you don't have to worry about the language in the same way. He quotes Gertrude Stein that, in a sense, you can be present in it without needing to know exactly what's being said. This is so Andriessen's De Materi it's a symphony of ideas. Which was first staged by Robert Wilson in, I think, 1989. And it was only its second ever performance in 2014 when Heiner staged it. And his staging of it, well, the bit that we're going to hear it's a movement between the third and the fourth movements. The third movement is one that's based on Mondrian, and it sounds, if you know Louis Andriessen's work, it won't surprise you. It's kind of somewhere between Boogie Woogie and Stravinsky. And then that's quietened down, and then we're into the next scene. And I think the clip we're going to hear to watch is from towards the end of a kind of transitional. It's about a 20 minute section.
Yeah, we'll see just
Very ending.
3 minutes or so, and then we're going to go into the final scene, which
Yep.
this gives nothing away to say that features Madame Curie. So we'll see that, and let me share screen, and we'll all enjoy it. So of course I'm tempted to just have us watch the entire thing. But we're going to stop there. If we've gone a little further, oh, let me stop one. There we go. Okay. We would hear Madame Curie speaking in English, actually. You were mentioning the different
That's
languages.
right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then a whole new scene begins, the final scene of the opera. It's pretty stunning. Certainly, one doesn't expect, even if one knows it's coming, an entire herd of sheep to
That's
come out
right.
on stage with no one leading them.
Yeah.
It's remarkable, let alone the interlit
It's
dirigible. So,
jaw-dropping.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's absolutely
And,
jaw-dropping. I saw it. I will say it's one of the most remarkable things I've ever experienced on a
yeah.
stage.
And
And
other people I know who've been there have said the same thing.
yeah,
So I was kind of felt compelled to try and find a way of writing about it. And
yeah, but you did beautifully, I'll say. It was wonderful to relive it, the experience. Quite
yeah,
wonderful reading the book. When you're in the audience, before you see the sheep, you smell them.
absolutely. I was
It's
going to say exactly that.
incredible. Yeah.
And
I,
it and
and you
it's
haven't before. I mean, they're back there somewhere, but somehow
well the thing that got me was not just their arrival. Because they you don't see them exactly enter because of the way that lighting is used, and the space you have to realize is cavernous. So it's in the Jahrhunderthalle in Bochum. No, it's not. Sorry, it's in the Landkraftspark, Duisburg. I'm going to get the title of that slightly wrong, but it's basically it's a former palace of industry that in the German style is no longer used for manufacturing, but is used for cultural events and activity. The kinds of spaces that Heiner was working in from the 1990s, before the Route Renale was conceived and started. But this particular space is the stage area was 160 meters front to back. I think 25 meters wide, 30 meters high, something like that. So actually, the production had not one but three Zeppelins, which were used variously as projection screens for text, internally illuminated, and other kinds of things. But so you don't see the sheep emerge. They're kind of, but by the time the light comes onto them, they're there. The thing that I found astonishing was the way that, and because I've watched the documentation a few times since then, it takes about a minute for all of the sheep, and it's 100 sheep. Heiner corrected me when I guesstimated 60, and when he looked at the draft, he said it was 100. But they leave on cue, and within that minute, the stage is set for Marie Curie at the Solveig conference on the quanta, and I'm going to forget the precise details. But it's when she gets the Nobel Prize, and it's just it's like if you couldn't have 100, if you had 100 school children, if you had 100 9-year-olds, you wouldn't get them off in a minute. So certainly not without some kind of half a dozen school teachers ferrying them out
yeah.
and making sure they got to
Quite
the right
frankly,
place at the right
training
time
100
and weren't distracted.
dancers or actors to leave together
Yeah,
cleanly would be remarkable. And of course, I saw it at the Park Avenue Armory. And if you told me this was a film of that, I would believe you because
yeah.
they behaved identically. It's really something. But to conceive of this purely on a practical level and to know that sheep might do this is already quite a leap,
That's
let
right.
alone convincing any theater to allow 100 sheep to be backstage and
And
then
just to
be
be clear, it was a
done.
different herd. They didn't. It wasn't. They weren't
No,
part
well,
of the.
that I'm sure of.
They weren't
Yeah.
shipped over for it. They weren't trained, and they
Well,
didn't
that's
have
even
equity
more
cards.
remarkable that other sheep would behave the same way. Well, quite frankly, like sheep, and we can talk
So
about what
yeah,
this
well,
might
exactly.
mean. Yeah.
So
So let's
he
talk about what the sheep, why there are sheep here. Why might there be sheep here?
well one small thing.
Yeah.
He had his first rehearsal with the sheep a year ahead of the show, the first
Hmm.
show. So
Wow.
he knew that he would need time to explore that. He had used or considered using animals as living objects with their own inner necessity that weren't, and we wouldn't observe them as beings like human beings that have a particular kind of intention or expression, which can be where they can. One of the particular things about humans is that we're good at lying as well as or masking who we are and what we're doing. Hence the whole theatrical practice of acting, where somebody pretends to be somebody else and in a particular situation and so on. The sheep are just sheep. So once you get over, or once you kind of sit with this amazement of this flock in front of you, just being a flock, some of the things that it led me to reflect on. I mean, Heiner was not. This was not a particular kind of message that he was trying to send. There wasn't a particular interpretation. When I've talked to him about this, the one thing that he has retrospectively said is that at some intuitive level, he might have been recalling going with his father to an airfield, and that there were gliders, but also this airfield also had sheep in it, and there was a shepherd, and he recounted a slightly funny story of talking to the shepherd about what you need to do to become a shepherd. But so at one level, it was intuitive on that level, but more fundamentally for me, I began to think of it was as what does it mean to observe a crowd in front of you, or a plurality of beings, of animals, of sentient creatures in front of you, and to make sense of that. And for me, I began to think, well, perhaps there's a way of what we're looking at is the way that we might also be looked back at. So if you're a sheep and you're coming into this strange space, you're looking at several hundred people, thousand people watching this performance, and all slightly odd and strange and unique and in their own way, but perhaps a little bit less orderly, not even necessarily thinking more coherently or cogently. So I began to think about this in a sense, not as a metaphor, but as a space where there was clearly something meaningful that was happening, but the meaning of what it had to be was suspended. The thing I volunteered was that it was a way for us to think about what it means to be in the presence of other audience members, other beings, other creatures. What kind of political space? How might we understand political space in that sense? So in the book, I use Arendt to think about what it means to be an individual, but an individual that is also part of a broader social group, and then use the sheep and the sheep scene as a way of reflecting back on that.
Yeah, so I love this idea of the sheep, there are layers of potential meanings, and how meaningful it is just depends on the watcher. But the idea that the audience itself is mirroring the behavior of what
Yeah,
we're watching. We all come in together, we all leave together. There
yep,
isn't an inherent leader, but maybe someone begins the exodus, or
that's right.
exit of the space.
Or like when the sheep did enter, and as you say, the first thing that the first thing that you sense is that you can kind of hear a little bit, but it's the smell.
Yeah,
'Cause
it's assaultive,
smell in a
really.
particular kind of way. That's right. And you'd hear like a titter, or not a titter, but like a kind of an intake of breath or something, and then that would kind of go across the audience. And of course, one of the terms that we use for that kind of experience of being in an audience is flocking.
Yeah.
It's used in English. So where I know somebody begins an applause at the end of a performance, for example. There's always that who's going to be the first person to start clapping their hands, and then it kind of goes in because it becomes conventional. But we do flock in all sorts of interesting kinds of ways. I took it as significant that one of the writers that Heiner is very interested in, he's used in a number of other performances, is Elias Canetti.
Mhm.
So Elias Canetti won the Nobel Prize for Literature, I think, in 1982 for a book called Crowds and Power. And this was his way. This was Canetti's way of trying to think about his own experience of being in a particular kind of political crowd, a crowd that had formed to try and seek, in a sense, popular justice when the justice system had condemned, had freed a number of people who had killed members of the citizenry. With kind of protests you might see today or experience today. And it was just this experience of being both an individual, but also part of a crowd that had its own logic and its own mentality that really fascinated him. And he began to search. It was like set off a lifelong search for thinking to how to understand crowds in that sense. And he used a lot of zoology to look at different ways that different kinds of animals behave to understand, and then relating that metaphorically or analogically back to the way in which humans behave in groups or in packs or in colonies. So, in a sense, this was an invitation to kind of explore that with Heiner. What I tried to do was to find a logic or whether it's a theorist or a writer or a set of ideas that were somehow in the work itself rather than try to ship it in from outside because I thought that might be interesting. But always
It's
things
so
that Heiner himself
fascinating.
referenced.
Yeah, yeah, it's so fascinating to think of the sheep here. And we almost can't not once we just start thinking about it in a political context. And I love that you brought up Arendt. When she writes about civil disobedience and that being something that requires groups. And yet, so it's group activity, that sort of defiance or political gesture. But at the same time, when we think of acting like sheep, we think of it as following and not thinking. So at the very same time, we have this group action happening in front of us with no one person. It's very Cajun in a way, it's non-hierarchical. And yet the group functions, all the sheep function as a group.
Exactly that.
So it
Exactly
is
that.
a community behavior, which is
And
lovely.
yeah, and then Heiner's writing about his method of production and the way in which he makes pieces, whether they are, if you like, his own pieces or whether he's curatorially composing pieces with a number of other artists, or certainly working collaboratively with others. It's often precisely about how not to impose or force, which would be a kind of violence, a singular meaning on an audience. That this is my expression and you have to understand it this particular kind of way. He's not interested in that. He's interested in the way in which we might bring our own curiosity and create an experience that wouldn't exist without our intelligent presence in the
Right.
space.
And that
So
is the participatory aspect. Really, we're not running out on the stage with the sheep, but we're invited to interpret it or not as we like, and to probably leave the theater and share very different experiences of what we just experienced.
that's right.
So,
So,
um,
so,
I
so
love that his as you quote him, and we can believe it or not, but that this all came about really from a childhood memory of seeing a flock of sheep on an airfield. So it's simply an image, and there
yeah,
might be nothing more to it than that, except it was a striking image as a young person.
yeah. What I came to understand in experiencing other of Heine's works. I mean, I first experienced his work in the late 1980s. Ensemble Modern came to London and performed Black on White, which is his tribute to Heiner Müller, with whom he had a number of years association with. Um, and uh, couldn't understand it, but found it absolutely compelling front to back, including one. There's a famous moment in that production where because the instrumentalists don't just play their instruments, they do all sorts of actions, and one of the actions is lighting a little stove kettle, and just as it reaches its boil, it produces a pitch, and the instrumentalist plays her piccolo with it in a duet with the teapot. And it's just like small things like that, which are kind of nonsensical, but have a kind of a magic or an insane moment to them. Anyhow, the thing
Well,
with
no discounting the delight of surprise, quite
yeah,
frankly,
oh,
alone. I'm sorry,
absolutely.
go ahead. Yeah.
But the thing that I found is consistent in his practice, which is very much echoing Cage. So if Cage was variations without a theme, if you like, that's the compositional logic. It's a similar kind of contrapuntal logic in the way that he makes work, and he makes work in which the no theme, the absence, is something that has been present before then. So it's a little bit like mold. What you get is the mold, not the object that has been molded in the first sense. You get the reverse of it. So he might start out with a placeholder text to work with his collaborators, which would include a scenic designer, lighting designer, sign designer, and so on. And he involves them all from the very beginning of the process so that there isn't one particular element or dimension that ends up leading and directing the others. And then he can kind of weave these. At one moment, the lighting might become more important. At another, the sound design might become more important. At another point, the live musicians might become more important. At another moment, the text might become more important. And each of these has a reference to a certain kind of way of understanding a performance in front of us, whether it's theatre or dance or music. And so it has this kind of waveform to it. But the placeholder text that he uses give a certain kind of a consistency to the way in which all of the different collaborators bring what it is that they contribute to it. And then when you remove that, it still has a sense of the flavor of what that thing is, even though that itself is not the structuring device that orders everything else that takes place. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The in this realm of what we're going to call curatorial composing, um, even though you have, let's say, a curatorial composer, it's not one person's work
No.
necessarily. That seems to be an aspect. I also love that just to stay on the sheep for one moment, because we could spend, 2 hours just on the sheep. But unlike, say, a Dada performance, and I think this is quite different, that, you know, I believe that we're invited as storytelling creatures to come up with meanings. We're just simply not told one. And so, you were talking about saying there were 60 sheep and there are actually 100. We count sheep. Sheep might suggest sleep. We follow sheep or we're followers. There's so many associations with sheep and flocks and groups. One can go on, and it might mean all of those things. It might mean none of them, but they're all rich.
As somebody who likes a good pun, I play with that quite a lot in writing about it. But precisely because it invites that, because as historical beings, we've grown up with sheep, or at least many cultures have, and that's entered our language through metaphor and continues to be productive in the way in which we understand meaning. So what he does is he invites us as audiences into a space in which meaning is present, but meaning is not defined or designated or necessarily intended. So, what we make together as a collective experience is something in which that meaning is to play for. I mean, you can take away your own particular interpretation, but what I find more interesting is the way that an audience flocks together, and the meaning that's created is something that is not just my possession, but is something that is shared. And it might not be something which is designated, oh, it means what we're looking at is a metaphor for a human crowd or for a human polity, but we're taking away something which has a feeling and an intensity to it that is meaningful and might have some of those dimensions and continue to resonate in different ways afterwards.
And so much of it really is about experience, whatever that might mean. And I think you make such an important point that in the work of Cage and Goebbels and others, we have just a little bit of time left, but we'll mention a couple of others. But this work is not meaningless. It is meaningful, Full, right? Meaningful,
Really.
but we're not told how to feel, that we need to feel a certain way. And that's what Cage certainly cared about. He talked about, he says, when I would hear the Hallelujah chorus, I feel like Handel is telling me how I must feel, and I don't want to be told how to feel. He doesn't
That's right.
think people shouldn't listen to Handel, but that's his experience. He wants to create a space for encounter with oneself,
Yeah.
experience something, right?
That's right. I think one of the things that is a difference between them that's worth marking, I think for
Yeah.
Cage, um, Cage is so systematic in a sense that he's well, there's a quote from Yanni Christou, because Christou studied with Wittgenstein as well as with a student of Altenberg, so had similar kind of connections in terms of Cage studying with Schoenberg, but also being interested in Wittgenstein amongst others. And Christou talks about he's a philosopher, but the philosophy comes out as music. And in a similar way, Cage can be understood philosophically in what he does, and he's got that kind of rigor to the way in which he composes. Heiner does as well, but Heiner, one of the things that is absent from Cage but is present in Heiner is the way that memory and meaning is invited in.
Yes.
Cage wouldn't give you that kind of he wouldn't play to the way in which we come as beings with a desire to understand and to give some kind of closure to what that kind of meaning might be. Heine, in a sense, is aware that that's something we're going to bring with us. We're going to invest something of ourselves in the performance. He's just not going to let us simply attach ourselves to a singular meaning. He's going to suspend that process. So that's a distinction between them.
I think that's absolutely right. Maybe, and just a couple of minutes left, maybe we could talk about just a couple of the other composers, maybe Pauline Oliveros or anyone else, and just how they also might differ from what we've talked about so far while still being within this realm.
Yeah. I've written about Pauline. I've got an article and I've got a book chapter which hasn't yet been published, but the article has been on her operas, which are relatively unknown.
Yeah.
But actually, if you look at her career, she comes to musical prominence in the mid 1960s, and um, her her first opera she begins to develop in 1990 with her partner Ione.
Yeah.
So that's 34 years, and then she died in 2016, and she was writing operas with Ione, really operatic performances through from 1993 to 2016. And actually, a lot of the pieces that she was doing from 1964 onwards, I think, or even before then, were they called them operas amongst herself and the collaborators that she was working with. Um, so there's a lot of deep listening, which there's a lot of understanding of deep listening, which is so attached to the ear and is so attached to orality and listening. And of course, there's such a wealth of thinking within there, and wonderful practice. But it's also theatrical. It's playful. It's funny in what she does. It's political. Um, the way in which, and it's not just Pauline. It's not just her own work. She's absolutely distributing that process with others. So deep listening becomes as much a practice of Ione's as it is of Pauline's. It's got Pauline's signature on it in many respects, but it's not. It's part of a field of practice, which I think is really interesting. So and there is a compositional logic to the way in which she works, which I've written about, but I can't unpack in 2 minutes. Um, but I think this is the interesting thing that composers bring a sensibility of the way in which experience is going to take shape or can take shape, without telling people how it is that they've got to experience it. And there's not just one way of doing that, there can be multiple ways of doing that. And there's not just one medium for doing that, there can be several mediums for doing it. But there are some principles that hold the same, and it's not stuck by genre, it's not stuck by a singular tradition. Authorship is distributed, and it's something which is, yeah, it's not attached to sound exclusively either. So, yeah.
That's what I find so wonderful about this overarching concept of ways of presenting opportunities for experience, let's say, spaces for experience that may focus on sound, but may not even have sound in them, but they're still composed in a sense.
So I mean,
As an offering.
there's a quote from Pauline I just saved, which is, "If there was a frontier in music, it's relationships and collaboration, and an aesthetic arena that is developed in performance." Which could be describing what I've just been saying, but that's from an interview in 1993 when she's beginning to develop the operas.
Wonderful. I think maybe that's a beautiful place to conclude
Yeah, I think
and
so.
invite all to continue experiencing what's around them and whether it's a curatorially composed work or not, quite frankly, just to stay present. Ed, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Jeffrey, for the invitation, and thanks everybody for coming. And if anybody's got questions or comments or observations or anything else, then feel free to get in touch. I'll just put a link, a shameless plug to the book in the chat.
Yes,
But you
the
can
book
probably
is
find me
just
online.
fantastic. Yeah, I hope everyone here will get their own copy and enjoy it as I did. Thank you all for being here. We'll be back next month with James Pritchett, where we will focus on the lecture on nothing, in fact,
Amazing.
and Zen and haiku. Lots more, I'm sure. Lots more coming up. Stay present, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.